Right, hello, I'm John Wedger, and this is one of a series of videos that I'm putting out entitled Wedger's Whistleblowers. And my role here is as an ex-Scotland Yard detective and a whistleblower, and I blew the whistle. I exposed deliberate child prostitution cover-ups by the police. And as a result of doing that, I suffered an ensuing bullying campaign in an attempt to silence me. Since leaving the police, I've now embarked on a quest, as it were, to reveal the truth, and I've been speaking to a variety of people, all regarding the subjects of child abuse, child prostitution, child abuse cover-ups, and I mainly speak with victims and survivors of abuse, but I'm also now speaking to a lot of professionals which have some sort of input on the subject. And I'm privileged to be in central London in a lovely building with my good friend here. This is Dr. Ali Ajaz, and Ali is a forensic psychiatrist, and I'll let him explain exactly sort of what your qualifications are, Ali, and you know how this sort of all involves yourself.
Yeah, well, thanks, John. It's a real pleasure and honour to be with you here today.
My pleasure.
So I'm a consultant psychiatrist working in the NHS for the last 13 years. A majority of that has been in the field of mental health. I'm an adult psychiatrist, so I deal with adults who have suffer from major mental health problems, are admitted and need treatment and rehabilitation in hospital. And I got in contact with you, John.
That's right, you did.
I think it was earlier this year. I was really interested by the things that you had to say and the problems facing our society and our young people. So I didn't know what else to do apart from Facebook you. And we've met a couple of times since.
We have. We've come up. You know, I approached Ali and said, "Would you be interested in putting your professional experience and your opinion in one of my interviews?" And the relevance being that so many of the people that I speak to now that have come from abuse backgrounds have either been in the prison system, or they suffer with addictions, and mental health seems to be a common thread as well.
Yeah.
And when we see that the fact, I can boldly state that the police at the time put hardly any resources into investigating child abuse, and that so much of what we're looking into now has its seat in child abuse, child traumatic backgrounds.
Yeah, I mean, so I guess from my professional point of view, early childhood experiences are really important when it comes to shaping and forming someone as an individual in order to reach their full potential in life. What I've seen in my own practice, and also what the research shows, is that early life experiences, so if they're adverse, if they're negative, traumatic experiences, then that is a significant risk factor for people developing a whole range of severe mental health problems that they can experience for the rest of their lives.
Yeah, and the people that I've been interviewing and working closely with, a lot of them were residents of care institutions where the abuse was endemic and it was systemic.
Yeah.
And so the kids couldn't complain because those that were running the systems were the ones that were the perpetrators. So a lot of their trauma went untreated. So if we take, for example, a hypothetical child that is then placed into this abusive environment, what sort of things would happen to them mentally in order for them to adjust and survive, and then later on what would be the ramifications of it?
Yeah. Well, I guess it's important to say first of all that I'm not a child psychiatrist, so I deal predominantly with, exclusively with adults. But there is a lot of literature around how children react to trauma and traumatic experiences. And usually some of the telltale signs are changes in their behaviour that didn't happen before the trauma or traumatic experiences. So things like bedwetting, things like having tantrums, things like becoming impulsive and aggressive and difficult to manage. So being really different in those sense than they were beforehand, and their school performance drops. They may associate less with friends. So a lot. Some of these are general, but common ways in which children can express their behaviour.
And to compound matters, what people would say to me was that they inevitably wet the bed, which ties in with what you're saying is a symptom, an indicator of what's going on. So they would then get beaten for wetting in the bed. Then you mentioned about sort of aggressive behaviour and that. And as a police officer, this is where we would start getting involvement, because these kids would end up being a nuisance, being arrested, kicking off. And at no point was all my time in the police, up until I joined Child Protection, was there any reference to the fact that this might be a victim of abuse? At no point.
Yeah, I mean, it's easier to think of, and we do this as adults, and we do this in the whole world around us, it's easier to blame individuals, to say someone is a bad person, or they're an evil group of people. So the blame is within them rather than something in the society around us. So it's a way that we commonly, all of us, do that to varying degrees, that we prefer to focus on what might be an easier explanation. So it's just a troublesome kid, or it's just an evil person.
And then, because none of this gets addressed, it just gets worse and worse and worse. And then all of a sudden, we're looking at prison. And did you have any dealings with the prison service?
Yeah, I mean, I frequently go to prison to assess individuals there who become mentally unwell. And
mental health wise, what would you say that the condition of the prison is, the system is?
Well, prison is a very difficult place, and it's a very stressful place. And some people who haven't had mental health problems overtly before prison, and the stress of that whole experience can trigger things, and can trigger a serious episode of either psychosis or mania or depression. So what you tend to see is those who become unwell in prison, it's a serious illness that manifests. So frequently those individuals that I assess in prison that need to be transferred to hospital for treatment are suffering from different forms of psychotic illness, different form of psychosis, so whether it's schizophrenia, schizoaffective disorder. So these are severe major mental illnesses. In addition to that, in addition to an illness, you have personality disorders, which you can't call, we don't consider to be an illness, because there's not something that's gone wrong that can be easily fixed.
Can you give us an example of a few of these?
So personality disorder essentially refers to how someone views themselves and views others. So themselves in the world around them, and views others as individuals in that world. And if you've had a traumatic childhood with lots of adverse experiences, you're more likely to have an abnormal personality, so what we call it personality disorder. So the ways in which you behave and relate to others are different, and can lead you into getting into difficult situations. So what we've got, some common examples when we talk about trauma and abuse, we have borderline personality disorder. Right. We have antisocial personality disorder.
Can you explain what a borderline personality disorder is?
So it's just what I've said in terms of what an abnormal personality is. Borderline specifically refers to those people who can develop very intense relationships, who become very impulsive. Right. So, for example, if you have an argument with your partner, you can go and take an overdose. Those people who can find it difficult to take responsibility for their own actions, can be very impulsive, and generally, really difficult really difficult to control their emotions. And what we see is they have quite a labile mood, and they're up and down and unpredictable. And they frequently engage in self-harming behaviour, cutting, overdoses, and they are at high risk of suicide because of that risky type of behaviour.
Right.
Yeah.
And because of the impulsive nature of it all.
Impulsive nature, and also if you're cutting, for example, and you cut too deep,
Well, and one of the things that kept cropping up was heroin when I was in the police, and a lot of the heroin addicts, when you actually got speaking to them, had come from child abuse backgrounds, mainly sexual abuse backgrounds. Did you see a similar correlation in your work?
Yeah, so in my work, so in addition to someone having a major mental illness, it's not uncommon to see substance misuse along with that, so what we call a comorbid illness. And again, the risk factors for developing, having a substance misuse problem are the same as having a mental illness. So we are looking at trauma, abuse, physical abuse, neglect, those types of inequalities, social inequalities.
I know it may seem very commonsensical, but why would someone turn to alcohol or turn to drugs in order to sort of cope?
I guess the simplest way, I guess most people can relate to these, is an outlet. So a way to maybe numb the pain, a way to distract themselves. And we all do that to varying degrees in our own life. But we're usually able to realise the limit of when it becomes harmful. But when you're faced with intense emotions, intense memories, intense thoughts, it's difficult to stop at times. So when the numbness wears off, when the drug wears off, you want more of it because you don't have the skills to cope.
And a lot of this, I would have thought, is untreated. So people are turning to things because
it's a form of self-medication, form of self-treatment. So they don't know how to deal with it. They're not, in all likelihood, getting much support around it, or feel as though they can't talk about it.
Well, that's exactly what I was going to say. That especially the men would say it's difficult for me to admit that I've been the victim of sexual abuse because it demasculates me, or whatever it might be.
Yes.
So therefore, they don't say anything. Now, when it comes to sort of therapy and I don't know, getting over this sort of stuff, if someone does actually speak about it, their recovery, is that different to someone who won't allude to the fact they've been abused?
Yeah, well, what the research shows is that if you've been abused and you develop an illness, a major mental illness later on in adulthood, if you're able to process and talk about that abuse and try and deal with it, and you get support around that, your prognosis for your illness and your symptoms improve at a better rate. So you have better prognosis and you have less symptoms than someone who didn't process or talk about that abuse. So that does show how pivotal this is in the whole mechanism of someone's life journey, bringing them up to the point of where they're suffering from these things.
It's got to be a hell of a mountain for someone to climb in order to start talking and open up all these old wounds that have been maybe suppressed for decades and decades.
Yeah, and in my line of work, I am surprised as to how some people find it easy to open up just knowing that you're a professional or you're a psychiatrist. I remember seeing this young chap who got himself in trouble with the police and he's facing some charges. And I wanted to speak to his dad to try and get a sense of this man's life and how his life had transpired, especially when he was younger. And the dad, after a few minutes, he just broke down. And he felt the need to tell me about the abuse that he'd suffered 40 years ago when he was a child. He was raped by his uncles, and he had an overwhelming sense to tell me this, and I was the only person he'd told. And in over 40 years, he'd kept this to himself, and it kind of all just came out.
Flooded out, yeah.
And he's a very proud man, a very masculine man, but he just couldn't hold it in any longer. So for some people, they carry this burden, but for some people, seeing a professional, it's an opportunity, and they find it a bit easier than others. But on the whole, it is very difficult.
Are there certain indicators of people's behaviour you can sit there as a professional now, you recognise what their background may have been?
Excuse me. Well, there's nothing so specific in the work that we do. So when we talk about mental illness, we see it as someone's more likely to develop mental illness if they have more risk factors. So early childhood abuse is definitely one risk factor, but also genetic. So if your dad has a major mental illness, you're more likely to have one yourself. So that's another risk factor. The way you were raised, the poverty or lack of money when you're growing up, your kind of adversity, all these things are risk factors for developing a mental illness in the future as an adult. So it's not so precise. So you can have a sense of the common things that contribute to this, and you can look for those, but it's less obvious to think, well, you know, you're presenting like this and you're talking like this, that means that you were abused when you were younger. It's you know, there might be some things if you're used to dealing with survivors of abuse, but generally it's a bit more difficult to be so precise.
I mean, in an ideal world, they will start taking the mental health a lot more seriously than they do, and also like child abuse, I saw that how it was deliberately underfunded, it was understaffed, we were overworked, and when you can see that so much of the problems that we face as a society are attributed to child abuse, for me it's a no-brainer. But it seems that our society, just, well, those in charge are not taking it seriously enough. I mean, from your opinion, how do you think that they're dealing with mental health?
Well, mental health is, just like most of the health service, is under a lot of pressure. So what services have been asked to do is to provide the same or better service with less money in this period of austerity. So it's a real challenge. That there's effectively less money available to deal with increasing problems, and not only to deal with them, but to deal with them at the same level as before. So it is a big challenge, and at the moment there's no easy option, there's no easy answer to say, well.
One of the things I found was that when I was working on Vice and was working with the street prostitutes, when you got to know them and you would talk to them, and sometimes they would start telling you a bit about their backgrounds, and all of them, every single one of them was on heroin, and every single one of them had been sexually abused as a child, and then they'd gone into prostitution because it was their way of making money, it's what they knew. And a lot of them had a hatred towards men. They were quite open about it and just said, I don't trust men. And but in respect to them using the only thing that they knew would make the money, which was sex, you know, is that something that you've seen?
Well, I guess there's a number of reasons why someone could go into prostitution, but what the research shows is that if you're a girl and you've been abused as a young child, you're much more likely to use sex as an instrument, as a tool to gain things. So whether it's for money, whether it's for shelter, the research shows that you're more likely to behave in that way. Now we can talk about perhaps why that is. That from a young age, depending on the type of abuse they had, that there was some token value in it. So even though it was traumatic, there was something they were getting out of it, and whether it's a learned behaviour that, you know, that's what they've taken with them, or whether it's the feelings of emptiness, the feelings of low self-worth, that all they're good for is having sex and being used and abused, and there's a way of that type of abuse being perpetuated.
This is another quite sad thing, is when people are telling me their stories and they just say they had like a self-loathing, you know, they felt dirty, and you sit there and it breaks my heart, because they, as children, they must have been so frightened and confused and not understanding what was going on.
I mean, it's really difficult. You've got depression as an illness that children can be diagnosed with, and adults can be diagnosed with. So you, as part of depression, you have these we call negative cognitions, negative thoughts about yourself and the world around you. So that's your own sense of self and self-worth, kind of hope for the future, hope for things changing, hope that you'll achieve something, and your own self-worth. And all these things are affected by things like depression, but also has a direct impact upon the trauma that people have had. We've spoken about a number of ways that people try and deal with it, so going to substances, for example, but there are other ways that the brain tries to protect, especially when you're a child, other ways that the brain tries to protect you from that trauma, and what we call defense mechanisms are psychological ways that your mind tries to protect you in the face of trauma or difficult experiences, and what some children tend to do is dissociate. So what they do
I'm
is
glad you mentioned that.
So what they do is they detach themselves from the reality of the trauma.
Yeah.
So either in the moment or from the memories afterwards. So they detach themselves from it, and in a way it becomes compartmentalized. It becomes in a certain part of their memory or recollection that they're able to take themselves away from it, because sitting with that all day every day.
It's referred to
too
as
much.
pigeonholing.
Yeah.
Putting the memory far away, so you can carry on with life. And
yeah, so that's another way that the mind does, and it's an unconscious process. So it's not something that you can do intentionally, and that can lead to and I know we've spoken about this a number of times. What people refer to as dissociative identity disorder.
Yeah, DID.
Yeah, and I think it's a controversial area because I don't think there's unanimous agreement by all people working in mental health that this is an actual phenomena. So some people disagree.
Yeah, and I'm getting quite a few people coming to me that have been victims of satanic ritual abuse, and it's one thing that I've spoke about a few times. It becoming more and more prevalent, and that the victims have got this DID, and they're quite open about it and say, this, or they refer to it sometimes as an altar.
Yeah.
And
yeah, well, I guess if we break down what we mean by dissociative identity disorder, so the dissociation that you do as a child can lead on to you developing this identity disorder, and it's not a multiple personality disorder, what some people refer to it as. That's a bit of a misnomer. What it refers to is that the single individual can have different parts to them. And that's as a direct result of this dissociation. So you have different parts to you, and these parts can be called alters. And some of these parts in extreme situations can become quite autonomous and have their own name and have their own kind of character to them, and they can become quite dominant and take over.
Yeah.
And what the individual, for certain alters, that you have an amnesia, so you forget what a particular alter.
This is another thing, is that when I've been with people that have been in that situation, and for instance it's kicked off, next day say, I don't remember that.
Yeah.
I just don't remember it.
Yeah.
But then they will at another time when they get in that state again, they'll remember it.
Yeah.
And it's seeing that a hell of a lot.
Yeah.
Quite a lot.
Yeah, so that's as a direct result of the mind trying to protect.
That's a survival thing.
It's a survival thing, and
Right.
the mind's such a sophisticated. We only understand a fraction of it and what it's capable of, and the true potential of people. So that can be a direct result of this type of trauma.
And it seems you do get it a lot with these ritualistic abuse, because I would have thought that's so harrowing for a young mind to deal with.
Well, yes. So the dissociative identity disorder and the dissociation generally happens in really severe, complex, sustained types of abuse, and something like SRA would fit that.
Have you come across SRA in a professional capacity, or victims of it? Sorry.
No one that's openly admitted to anything like that. Certainly sexual abuse, yes, but not SRA in my professional capacity to date. No.
I must admit, in the police, not so much, but since I've left, a hell of a lot. Well, that's the right term for it as well.
Yeah.
Right, going along them lines, there was something I was meaning to ask you. Very similar to what we were just saying about the disassociated stuff, right? And there is a difference then also with psychopaths. I mean, this is another thing which would crop up quite a lot.
Yeah, so when we talk about a psychopath, what do we mean about psychopath? I guess that relates more to when we're talking about someone's those who are suffering from personality disorder. So it's a form of abnormal personality. It's a form of abnormal characteristics in a state, characteristics in an individual. So a psychopath is someone who is generally cold, callous, self-centered, is able to commit very selfish, very horrendous acts without feeling guilty or any remorse. And again, that people aren't generally born like that. People aren't born psychopaths, and it's usually a reaction or a development over time to certain types of trauma or adverse.
The other term is sociopath.
Yeah.
What is a sociopath?
So I think sociopath is more of a layman's term. So
Right.
sometimes, especially in mental health, you can have technical terms that get used interchangeably with layman's terms.
Right.
So as far as I understand it, sociopath isn't kind of related to psychopath.
Yeah.
But again, what I think, from a layman's perspective, what it refers to are people who use society, who use others for their own gain, but don't have any kind of remorse or kind of regret around putting people out or taking advantage of them. I think that's from my reading of it, but that's just from my own.
And the other thing is that when I've been in quite a few court cases and with perpetrators of abuse, and sometimes in mitigation they would bring up the fact that they themselves were abused. Can we talk about the pattern between abusers and abuse? This.
Well, again, the research shows that if you're a victim of, if you're a perpetrator of abuse, you're much more likely to have been abused yourself as a child. So there is a direct link there, absolutely. I don't specialise in profiling pedosexual activities, but people who do, if you read some of their literature and their books, that's something that they talk a lot about.
And yet there are others that have been abused, and the last thing they would ever do would hurt a child. It's the most abhorrent thing you can imagine. And actually, there's one fellow I know that even if he sees someone shouting at their child, it's a trigger, and he has to run and protect that child. He said he cannot stand a hair on that child's head being harmed.
Yeah. And that's probably the most complex part of dealing with human beings, is that not everyone's the same and not everyone reacts in the same way, and you can have someone having two different people having the same experience but reacting in completely different ways, and we get a part of that when it comes to mental health and psychiatry, that you have the same illnesses but they just manifest in different ways, and your approach to helping someone and giving them hope has to be different. So it is a big challenge, absolutely.
Oh yeah, no, it must be. And I get phone calls in the middle of the night sometimes with people that want to talk to me, and they're on the verge of suicide, and I don't know what to do. I had to get the police to a guy the other day for his own safety, because he was going to kill himself, and he was grateful and he thanked me for it. But again, it all comes back down to child abuse. It keeps coming back time and time again.
Just on that, people, if anyone's going through a traumatic experience or trying to deal with it, there are services out there. You have your GP as a first line of call for anything. There are charities out there who try and help with victims of this type of abuse. Kind of reach out, don't kind of hold on to yourselves. And I think you have to also be careful as well, kind of the situations that you kind of get in where people's lives are,
and I don't want to say or do the wrong thing, and it pushes someone, because I'm untrained in it, pushes them to a level, and that is the important thing out there, that there is help. It's easy for us to lose hope and see that the NHS aren't there to do the right thing, and they're cutting back on all these important avenues of medicine and everything else, but there are people that specialise in mental health that know what you're going through. They've dealt with it day in, day out, like Ali, and the help is there, but it's just difficult for them to get it.
The services, there's, through my own experience of working in mental health services across the country, predominantly in London and the South East in Kent, majority of people, overwhelmingly, who work in mental health are amazing people who are there to effectively just to help people through their difficult lives, and to make things better and to make a difference. So the services are there, the people are there, everyone's under pressure, but the services are there, and I would always recommend people reaching out, whether it's directly to your GP or to someone else in mental health services. That the structures are there, and try and make use of them. And I know there's stigma attached to that. People don't want to be labelled or afraid of what might happen. But it's something that I would strongly encourage.
I mean, I myself got diagnosed with post-traumatic stress due to the police, and it was a big step for me to have to take therapy for it. And it was like, I found it demeaning to start with, but in the end it wasn't. It was the best thing that could have happened, and I'm really grateful. It was the ability to talk unjudged.
Yes.
You know, and that's the thing, is going before a professional, because you won't be judged.
Yes.
You know, and the help will be there.
That's right.
You know, and there was something I was going to say to you regarding that, Ali. And yes, this is it. This is the important thing, that what we were discussing earlier, where those that have made a disclosure that the fact that they have been abused, their recovery rate is noticeably higher than those that don't, and that's quite an amazing thing, really.
The degree of their symptoms is less, so there's an improvement if they talk about their abuse and able to process that. And there are a number of different approaches. There's no one approach to say, well, this works best for childhood victims of physical abuse or sexual abuse, but there are a number of approaches, and if you've got a skilled therapist, they can help you and work through that with you. So there are ways, and specifically for sexual abuse, there are ways and there are approaches that are helpful, and the literature has shown that, you know, is helpful. So there are techniques and there are ways. I'm
so grateful for you coming forward and talking like this, Ali, because it is just something which keeps cropping up. It's keeps cropping up because at the end of the day, someone's got to pick the pieces up of these shattered lives, and people. It is called mental health for a reason, because they are unhealthy in their mind, some people, and they are hurt and they need help. And when you come forward and offered your expertise, it really went down a long way. So look, God bless you, and thank you so much for this. God bless everyone else out there, and don't give up.